Lacy Simmons is a licensed therapist and clinical social worker here in Los Angeles, California. One of her professional areas of focus includes working to support the mental health and recovery of unhoused Angelenos as they transition from street homelessness into permanent supportive housing. Additionally, in Lacy's private practice, she is known as the boundary therapist and works with adults on understanding the importance of establishing healthy boundaries in all aspects of their lives. Lacy uses multiple treatment modalities to address trauma recovery, including EMDR. Hi, friend. It's good to see you.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. I would just love for you to tell the audience who you are, maybe where you're from, share a bit of background on what led you to pursue your career in psychotherapy and clinical services. And yeah, tell us who you are.
Sure. My name is Lacy Simmons. I am a licensed psychotherapist in California, specifically residing in Los Angeles. Some of my professional experience involves working with the unhoused population. And in my private practice, I focus on boundary work and work with a lot of folks who are living with chronic illness or trauma and do some EMDR as one of the modalities that I use. So most of my work is still virtual, which came out of the pandemic with clients, but it is really nice to see people locally when I'm able to. And there's so many different things that got me into becoming a therapist, but one of them is really just diving in and doing my own work and realizing how helpful that was for me and the ways in which supporting people through talk therapy and trauma therapy can be so just really important and sort of learning the skills that we need to be the best versions of ourselves.
Thank you so much for, giving us that context. So I'd love to dive right into a little bit about how your background working, in mental health and your passion for that intersects with the issue of homelessness and kind of just talk about, I guess, if you can share what challenges you try to address and that you faced in that arena.
Yeah, definitely. So I work with folks who are unhoused in Los Angeles and specifically sort of coming off of street homelessness, working toward permanent supportive housing and support them in their mental health journeys. So we really work with people who have a spectrum of mental health concerns ranging from, what one might consider, not as traumatic and maybe generalized anxiety disorder all the way up to schizophrenia and some of the more major psychotic disorders. So we provide individual therapy, group therapy, substance use counseling, so many different services to folks to really support and aid them in their journeys to becoming more stable. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Los Angeles, homelessness is a huge public health crisis that we have here. And so there's a really big need for supporting folks that are living on the street. And one of the aspects to that is just supporting them through their mental health. It's pretty hard to help get folks stability without addressing that. And with that can come some challenges because unfortunately, systems haven't been set up to really support folks in that. So we work with a lot of people who've come from very traumatic backgrounds in the mental health pipeline, if you will. So that's always a really interesting thing to navigate. And so how we present mental health treatment to people looks really non-traditional sometimes and different than maybe a private practice setting.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I think it's an overwhelming issue to many, but it's also very overlooked, right? When we have privilege that if it doesn't touch our lives, it's easy to not care about it, and to not get involved. So yeah, it's just amazing that you willingly chose to get involved in this issue and you see the importance and giving people their dignity too and their access to mental health care. So I was going to say too, what are some of those barriers, especially if someone isn't aware that they may need services or maybe don't want services, but they want help and they don't know how to get it, what is step one? Where do you begin with them?
Well, so I think to answer your first question, we could have like a whole podcast on just like
Yeah.
what are the barriers, right? But I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
first and foremost, I
Mm,
am a social worker at heart. And so I think
mm,
it's really necessary to acknowledge that the systems in which folks that we work with that are of lots of intersectionalities that are oppressed, right, have to navigate systems that are not set up for them. And so navigating social services, navigating how to get income, navigating social security, all of these systems are inherently oppressive, right? And so it is really difficult for the folks that we work with to really get what they need without advocacy and someone with privilege being able to support them with that, unfortunately. There's just so many challenges to even getting people into interim housing, which is sort of the first step in getting someone stability before we're able to get them permanent housing. And the program that I specifically work with actually works with people who have come from the street into a temporary housing situation and are working toward getting their documents ready so that they can apply for a government subsidy so they can get housing, right? So we run into so many challenges in that process with just getting people the resources that they need. There's so many hoops that folks have to jump through. And I think it's really easy for outsiders sometimes to just be like, homeless people are lazy or they don't want to get jobs or whatever the case is. But the reality is most of us, if we only had a backpack on our back, would have a really hard time keeping track of things like our IDs and our social security cards, right? Which are like such important things to being able to get the services that you need. Yeah, exactly. So our approach really is just to meet folks where they're at, right? So services are optional that we provide to people. We don't force people to meet with a therapist or be consistent. And again, therapy can look really different for the needs of the client, right? So a lot of our clients are more comfortable meeting at the beach or going on a walk for a therapy, and that's totally okay with us. Or some of the ways in which we sort of add in skill building and coping skills groups to the facilities looks really non-traditional, and that really comes from the feedback that we've gotten from the population of folks that say this is what we need, right? So we really try to take an approach of like what is the community saying makes them feel most safe, and how can we cultivate an environment where people have a bridge to just start building healthy relationships again. And for some people, that might be like the biggest thing that they do. And the greatest achievement with a therapist is just being consistent and showing up on a weekly basis. And that's a huge win. So it really varies from person to person, and obviously depends also on the person's sort of barriers, personal barriers, right? Like some folks are choosing not to be medicated and have psychosis, and that's okay with us. And but that might look like very different therapy than someone who's able to show up and have a full 50-minute session and
yeah.
talk about their past trauma.
Yeah. It sounds like you have to be really flexible as a social worker
Yeah,
to work with this population as well, because I mean, they kind of come from not having structure in their lives. And I think that can be overwhelmed. I can imagine in putting myself in their shoes that, just to start is really daunting. And I think for a lot of people, like that can be paralyzing just to take the first step, just to ask for help or to seek out services or to go for that first walk for
totally.
therapy. So that's something I really appreciate about you on a personal level as my friend, just the openness and the compassion you have for others in terms of meeting them where they're at, and
Hmm.
not trying to, yeah, change them. just meeting people
Hmm.
where they're at. And I think sometimes we overcomplicate it. Some of these issues that these are all human beings that deserve, yeah, that dignity and that support just like anyone else. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely.
So we talked a bit about the barriers, but is there a success story? We don't have to use names or anything, but that stands out to you from this work you've been doing for years now. Yeah, from any of the people you've worked with that just kind of stands out to you and has impacted your career and how you go about it.
Yeah, for sure. Honestly, so many success stories. And I think that
Mm,
that is one thing that I always think is really important to speak to when people ask me
mm,
about doing this work is folks are quick to be like, wow, it's so admirable and, blah, blah, blah. But for me, it's like this work has actually changed my life by I've learned so much from the people that I work with, right? Like so many people have incredible life lessons that they also pass on to us in the therapeutic work and just being able to really see the resiliency of someone who's been able to survive chronically on the streets of Los Angeles for years and years is it's mind-blowing, right? So
yeah.
like I personally have never experienced homelessness. I've never had to sleep on the concrete. Um, but just to know that folks have been able to come back from that, I think in itself just needs to be recognized and celebrated. But one client, yeah, that comes to mind is a person who was in interim housing for honestly, I think probably close to 5 years, which for our programs, there isn't a timeline necessarily. Like, we do obviously want people to move toward their goals, but we also recognize that meeting people where they are sometimes means we have to be very trauma informed in how we're approaching the expectations, right? And so
Mm,
this individual was someone that a lot of service providers had lost hope with. Like,
mm,
they were like, this person's probably likely never going to be able to be independently housed.
mm,
And after 5 years of being in the shelter environment and people having a lot of patience and meeting them where they are and rehabilitating sort of their, function,
mhm,
they were able to move into permanent supportive housing. And I think
mm,
to me, that was just such an incredible thing to experience because I
mm.
was reminded that it's never too late for anyone, right? Like
Yeah.
even the folks who are labeled as like too difficult to work with
Mm,
or whatever the case may be, what it comes down to is just like really recognizing that people's trauma shows up
mm,
really differently for them and we
mm,
can't just treat everyone the same in order and have the same expectations for people. And I think that
mhm,
goes this for the same with you and
mm,
I or
mhm.
anybody else where it's
Yeah.
we have to recognize that some people need different interventions and that's
Mhm.
okay. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, to see that they were able to move into this next phase of life
Mm,
is really empowering and awesome
mm,
to see and something that really definitely leaves an impact on me of like, okay, people can change, and it's
yeah.
on their
Yeah.
timeline, but
Yeah.
also we can't give up on each other.
Yeah. I can only imagine how that kind of impacts you personally and the relationships you have. And yeah, it probably just colors everything, that type of experience with work. Because some people don't have, those jobs where they're interfacing with people with these needs, these types of needs every day. So I think, yeah, it's amazing that you could be there and celebrate other people's wins. I think we don't talk about that enough too, what it means to celebrate each other's wins and not just gloss over it, because we tend to focus on sometimes the harder things and not what's going well or even just progress, in
Hmm.
different areas of our lives that is a win that you are trying. So I know you told me that in the past too, on a personal level, that just, there is something to be said for just trying and putting yourself out there. And what would you say to the people that have those biases about, this population in particular and just these assumptions? Like, how do we fight against those? Because I
Yeah.
know I live in Santa Monica and I know a lot of, obviously, it's an issue, in my area as well. And it's kind of everywhere. And a lot of people I've spoken to that live in the neighborhood are really upset by it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's been really confusing, I guess, for me because I don't see it as an inconvenience or
Mm-hmm.
anything. It's just, yeah, everyone is a different person and you don't know their story.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah,
yeah.
I know. And that's just something I appreciate about you is that you continue to fight to see people
Mm,
as people. And I think that that is my advice to everyone, right? I
mm,
think we have a tendency to want to see homeless folks as
mm,
less than a human and not look at them when
mm,
we are at a stoplight and someone's panhandling, but to
mm,
really challenge your humanity and
mm,
remember that that person is someone's brother, someone's
mhm.
son,
Yeah.
someone's, you know, past colleague,
Mhm.
potentially current colleague.
Yeah.
And the list goes on, right? And
Yeah.
so just fighting to see the humanity in
Mm,
folks, I think is a really important first step because it allows us to connect just on a human level and
mm,
have that empathy and compassion in a way that when we degrade someone to less than a human, we don't
mm,
see them for them, right?
mm.
We see them as dirty, we see them as problematic, we see their substance use, we see hopelessness, right? And like, yeah, I've just heard from so many of my clients like what an impact it makes when someone will
Mm,
actually look at them in the eye on the street.
mm,
You know, it's like this
mm.
the smallest thing. So,
That's a very practical thing then that we can give people because I often think about that. When you're sitting at a stoplight and people are like, oh, I feel uncomfortable and I feel awkward. And it's like, oftentimes, do you really think those people like want to be, like asking for money or for food or something? Like, it's a very like vulnerable thing.
hmm
So it's like some of the people I've met and gotten to talk to on the streets, it's like interesting because, yeah, I've heard that same thing where they're just like, thank you for just like taking a moment. And it's so easy to be so self-focused and,
or
um,
to assume like, oh, I have to give
yeah,
them something or do something.
yeah,
And it's like,
yeah,
no, you don't. In
yeah,
fact, like for me, I
mm-hmm,
don't tend to give
mm-hmm,
people money unless I
mm-hmm,
really feel like it's like impressed on my spirit. But
mm-hmm,
and I have my own personal reasons for that, but
mm-hmm,
a lot of it is
yeah,
just around,
mm-hmm,
you know, it's difficult sometimes to make
mm-hmm,
decisions for yourself of like
yeah,
what to do with money,
mm-hmm,
and especially when you're in desperate situations. But again,
mm,
you don't have to
yeah,
give people money. You don't
yeah,
you you can give them food, you can give
yeah,
them nothing, you can give them a
yeah,
smile and a hello, and that actually
yeah,
might be just what they needed today to keep
mm,
going for the next day.
yeah. Yeah. Or I find even just asking them what their name is,
Mm,
because I think
mm-hmm,
so often that that's like a really simple way to make someone feel seen. It's like even if we sit in meetings or whatever, or doing this podcast, it's like, I'm introducing myself or you're introducing yourself. And that's just such like something we kind of take for granted, I guess, in
mm-hmm,
everyday life. And that's something too. It's like, hey, I see you, you're special, and like, you matter, and it's
yeah.
just such a simple thing. So I love that. That's very practical, I think, takeaway for people. But you mentioned something about trauma-informed care, which is kind of an area you and I both connected over. So you mentioned one of the modalities you've utilized is EMDR, but I was curious for people who maybe don't know much about what trauma-informed care is and means. I know that's a very big question, how would you explain it to them? What is trauma-informed care? And also, I guess the second part to that, how do you utilize that when you're in terms of the services that you're trying to provide for this population?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, simply put, trauma-informed care is really just about meeting people where they're at and
Mm,
recognizing that we all have experienced some
mm,
form of trauma, right? And
mm,
I think that something that society loves to do is compare traumatic events and
mm,
trauma that people experience, and I am so against that
mm,
because what we could have gone through the same exact event, and
mm,
for me it could have been a really traumatic experience, and
mm,
for you your resiliency carried you through and you were like,
mm,
I feel fine, right? So I think that's the tricky thing about trauma is
mm,
that we have to be very careful to honor that people's experiences really differ, and
mhm,
that really impacts the way that they show up in as humans and are able to function through the difficulties of life. So, trauma informed care is about recognizing that we've all been through some aspect of trauma and being sensitive to that and the and how
mm,
we work with them. So, from a clinical lens, that looks like, slowing down and creating safety as much as
mm,
possible in the relationship for people so that they can navigate, through life and learn
mhm,
skills to support them through, life with trauma, but it also can be applied to every single profession out there where again it's
mm,
just recognizing that our different intersectionalities have
mm,
often come with experiences that have impacted us,
mm,
and we can treat people with compassion and empathy and stay curious and ask
mm,
about people's experiences rather than labeling them or responding from a stereotypical mindset, right?
mm,
So, again, this isn't just a concept that applies to mental health work. It is
mm,
a concept that really should apply to just how we approach relationships, whether that's professional, personal,
mm,
or otherwise. And I think can really help to bridge the gap between a lot of misunderstandings
mm,
and yeah, just create a bridge to staying curious of like how can we actually connect and support one another through our
mm.
life experiences and learn from each other instead of judging one another.
That's beautiful. Yeah, learning, also listening long enough to hear someone. What is that saying? I think it's something like listening to hear and not like waiting to be heard or something like that. I don't know how it goes exactly, but yeah, I think sometimes we listen with the intention through our own lens of how does this apply to me? And sometimes too, it's just about being present with that person.
Totally.
Like you said, it really is that sometimes simple, but it's interesting how the simple thing can be so uncomfortable
Yeah.
for us and challenge us. So yeah, but that's beautiful. But kind of switching gears a little bit. So on Instagram, you're known as the boundary therapist. So I would love for you to talk a little bit about, I guess, how did that even come about? How did your kind of focus or passion on creating healthy boundaries kind of inform your own life and inform your work?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So, through my career in the nonprofit world as a clinician, as I started to kind of move up and oversee programs, you become less client focused. And for me, it's really important to stay connected to therapeutic work. And so starting my private practice really was a way for me to be able to do that because,
Mm,
now I'm blessed to be able to sort of pour into new therapists and
mm,
interns and the work, but I don't do the work of specifically working with folks who are homeless, right?
mm,
So that was sort of the pivot that helped me feel like, okay, I'm still connected to people. I'm still using my skills. I'm still learning. And out of that really just came, I started attracting a sort of a certain group of folks. And part
mm,
of that is due to my own life experience. I live with a chronic illness, and I personally had a really difficult time finding a therapist when I was diagnosed who specialized in chronic illness and mental health, and just realizing how separate we really treat the body and the mind piqued my interest into sort of how can I be a bridge to be connecting some of these things because that was so important for me and continues to be. And so just naturally and sort of being in the chronic illness community and stepping into that space, I tend to work with a lot of folks who have a range of chronic illnesses. And yeah, that's part of the sort of part of the story of where the boundary therapist came from. I have had to learn how to create healthy boundaries in my life as for many reasons, but one of them was definitely the onset of my diagnosis and just really trying to figure out like how do I still have a healthy social life and you know still show up at work and still show up for myself. And that was super difficult for me, especially with limited energy. And, we've talked about this a lot where it's a continued thing. I'm not by any means like a guru at this
Yeah,
point.
yeah, of
But
course.
yeah, that is just definitely an example of how boundary work is just necessary in any healthy relationship. Again, whether that's with yourself, whether that's romantically, interpersonally, professionally. And I really feel called to want to be the best version of myself and help folks to facilitate that in their own journeys as well. And I think without learning how to hold healthy boundaries, it's pretty impossible to do that. That's where my content sort of focused on Instagram. And I don't just focus on boundary work in my um, private practice, but it is definitely a foundation and staple that I talk with all of my clients about and get curious about in the very beginning of our work because most of us just frankly haven't had the greatest experiences or
Yeah.
tutorials around how to create and sustain healthy boundaries.
Absolutely. I think it's something, honestly, I only learned about in college when I had to read this book when I was training to be an RA called Boundaries by Henry Cloud. And so we were like just learning then. And I did not have, even after reading that, I did not have good boundaries, you know? So it was
Yeah.
like, how do you have good boundaries where you live and work in the same place? You know, that was like a big thing then. And people always need something from you. So I had some unhealthy coping mechanisms like hiding and not going back to my dorm, so I would just disappear so they wouldn't have access to me to help them.
Totally.
So I mean that's a terrible, I never said that before, but that's a terrible
That's
example,
real though. And
you
I'm
know.
actually really glad that they had you read
Yeah.
that book. That shows
Mm-hmm.
that they had some awareness of like, oh, this is like a really
Yes.
hard thing. Because being an RA, I
Yeah.
can't even imagine. Somebody always needs you
Yeah.
for something.
Yeah, and then we had such a wide range of needs. It could be from I need a new roll of toilet paper for for our suite bathroom, or it was like, you know, we had like an instance of cutting one time, and you know, there was like a depressive episode happening, and you know, it's like, oh, I'm not fully trained in this, but we got like one little class in this book, and okay, like, you know, how do we navigate this, you know? So that was a unique experience, I feel like, in my life. But yeah, that's amazing. Also, I'd love to touch on it a little bit because I know this is also another way we've connected is in terms of our chronic illnesses. We don't have to talk about the specific diagnoses because I actually don't think that always matters. I think
Hmm.
there's the through line of just that experience. And I think it's actually really interesting because you and I both, I think, have the same heart for people in terms of making them feel seen. Yet we live
Hmm.
in a body where we can feel so unseen at times,
Yeah, totally.
because we live in such a able-bodied society, and chronic illness is, I mean, I don't know the statistic off of my head, but at least in the United States, it's a massive, like so many people are dealing with chronic illness. And
Mhm.
it's such a almost universal thing. And if you're not dealing with it, you probably know someone who is.
Mhm.
And so I think, I guess, not only is you as a therapist, but just Lacy as a person, Lacy as a friend, what advice would you give to people that aren't chronically ill in terms of support? How can they best support their friends who are dealing with that?
Yeah, that's such a great question. Well, like first and foremost, I think it is really important to point out the
Mm,
connection between trauma and chronic illness, right? And I think
mm,
that again, you and I have talked a lot about this where the majority of people that I have worked with, that I talk to, that I know in my community have had some touchstone of experiences where they can go back in life and say, like, yeah, I went through this really traumatic thing, and then interesting, there could be a correlation between the onset of some of my symptoms, right?
mm,
So sometimes we're more aware of that than other times. But I do think like it's very, very important to point out that like the stress on the body
mm,
oftentimes is what manifests these conditions within ourselves. And, that's a very simple way of putting
yeah.
it. But if you haven't read The Body Keeps the Score, that's
Mm,
definitely a great place to start. But for me, I would say my piece of advice would just be stay curious because people with chronic illness, we don't stop being chronically ill. And I think that it's really common for people to show a lot of compassion and empathy and attention to people when
mm,
they first receive a diagnosis.
mhm,
Sometimes people never receive a diagnosis, right?
mhm.
So
Yeah.
believe people, number
Mhm,
one, when they share with you that they're struggling, and number two, stay curious in how you can support them. Keep
mhm,
asking questions, and yeah, just don't be so quick to assume that things will never get better or that they're not going to get worse or
mhm,
just because they're showing up as what you appear, you know, to seem
mhm,
like they're doing great that day, they might not
mhm.
be, right? So just
Yeah.
continuing to ask the questions around like what do you need today and
Mm,
what would be comfortable for you? And again,
mhm.
by all means, I'm not saying like people should cater their lives around us,
Yeah.
but I do really appreciate it in my long-term relationships when people keep asking me like,
Mm,
how's that going for you? Or I
mm,
know you shared that you had that procedure coming up.
mhm.
What did you find out from your
Yeah.
doctor?
Yeah.
Um, is that something that like you
Mhm.
relate to or
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. I feel
yeah.
like that's exactly like spot on. And that goes for so many things too, that it especially goes for like mental illness too, because I think again, we shy away from what we don't know or what we're uncomfortable with. And that's something
Mm-hmm.
we need to stop doing that, because I also think it's trusting, giving people back their agency to decide. Because
Yeah.
I find with chronic illness, you feel that lack of agency a lot and you feel like you don't have a lot of choices sometimes. And I feel like it's just like an added layer when someone kind of makes a choice not to engage with you in that way. And then you can decide if you don't want to talk about it that day or you're not in the mood to discuss it, that's fine. But I think giving people the option,
Mm,
because I know I feel very seen when a friend asks me like, yeah, like how are you feeling today? Like I know
mm-hmm.
it's different for you. Or I even learning if it's a close friend, like, hey, like, what's the name of your diagnosis again? And they go like educate themselves. I know that's
Yeah.
another big thing too, because it is already exhausting living with with something,
Mm-hmm.
let alone having to constantly explain all the ways you don't even know how it's supposedly, I mean, WebMD, Mayo Clinic, whatever, there's all these symptoms, but it's so much more than
Mm-hmm.
that. And I think too, I always say it can feel very limiting, but it doesn't mean I can't live in the posture of like having this limitless life, if that makes sense. It
Yeah.
just may look differently. And I
Yes.
think, yeah, we're so accustomed to this cookie cutter, or it's like, I have to be married by this age, have to have kids by this
Totally.
age, all of these things. And that there's no like one, road in life to take to have this
Yes.
fulfilling life or have this impactful life. So I know you're one of
Yeah.
those friends for me that's inspired me in that way, and us having conversations like this, because I feel like, yeah, sometimes we focus, it's like polarizing. We either over focus on this one area and it's like, well, I'm not the sum of what I struggle with.
Totally.
But at the same time, if we don't talk about what we struggle with, we're also feeling limited or trapped or unseen.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think just giving people the option, and
Yes. Yes.
yeah, is like a
Like
big
you
thing. So
like you always say, like, keep inviting us to things. Like,
yeah,
keep
yeah,
asking, right? Like, don't
yeah.
make
Even if I say
assumptions.
no every time,
Right.
like it's still the invitation is so important. And I
Yes.
think like so easy to not show up for yourself after a while when it becomes that difficult. And so you need those people that are gonna, whether it's a friend who also struggles similarly or they don't. But I know like a friend of mine who doesn't, like she'll be like, I'll come to you, but like, let's go out for a walk? Like she'll try and
Yeah.
like coax me out to do things. And even if I have to modify that, and some days it's like you're really not feeling it, and it's
Hmm.
a hard no. But other days it's just like someone that sees like the possibilities for you when it's hard to see them for yourself. And I think that's what you do in working with the unhoused, but you also do that in just your everyday, clients that we're all human. And I think there's also a lot of intersectionality, like a lot of what you were discussing with trauma informed care. I mean, there's a lot with homelessness and human trafficking and domestic
Mm,
violence. And, like there's a lot of overlap there,
totally.
and there's complexities to each of these things. But I guess kind of going back, we talked about all these different kind of things, but what would you say to someone who's maybe just overwhelmed by, okay, I want to change the way I relate to people, but like kind of where do I begin? Like is it reading The Body Keeps the Score? Is it just kind of educating yourself? Like where do people begin? For me, I always suggest therapy. I think everyone needs to start in therapy because I think it is not a weakness, of course, and we just need to normalize, asking for help, at times, or just gathering tools. It's like, I don't know the tools I need until they're presented to me sometimes.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh, that's a great question. And again, I think it depends on the level of privilege that you hold in the world. Of course, if you have access to being able to go to therapy, I think that's an incredible place to start. But I
Mm,
also recognize
yeah.
that mental health is not accessible for everyone.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if that is being able to get your hands on a library
Mm,
book, then
mm,
yes, absolutely. The Body Keeps the Score is a great one.
mhm,
Boundaries by Nedra Tawwab is a great one to start with
mm,
if you want to
mm,
do boundary work. But also, podcasts, just like the
mhm,
platform that you've created here
mm,
to really be able to share information. Thank you so much for just holding this space and being able to have a point of access for people because this is a free way that folks get to educate
mm.
themselves.
Yeah.
So jump into listening to some podcasts. And if that's also not your thing, I always love the concept of volunteering. So find
Mm,
a nonprofit or an
mm,
agency that really intrigues you or speaks to you
mm,
and see how you can get involved because working with the folks that nonprofit serves is going to
mhm,
be the best and most accurate data collection that you could
mm.
ever find, right? So being
Yeah.
able to kind of
Yeah.
get in front of the people that do the
Mm,
work is
mm.
super key.
Mm, I love that. And I guess to add on to that a little bit too is going in, making sure you go in with the posture to really listen and learn to what the needs are. Because I think it is really easy based on our own personal experiences to assume what another person may need. And I think
Hmm.
we do that a lot in like our day-to-day lives,
Yeah.
instead of just asking, what is it that is most helpful for you? Or if
Yeah,
you don't know, like, how can we work together to find what that is? So I think it's a little bit of creativity and problem solving too sometimes that, really leads to some breakthroughs. So
absolutely.
um, I was gonna say too, one of my last questions is, so how do you see the landscape of mental health and kind of this boundary work you're doing, trauma-informed care? How do you see that evolving? Because I feel like the
Mm,
mental health conversation, I don't know, would you say it's been in the last 10 years or 5 years that it's really become less stigmatized, that people are talking about it more, or what is your take on that?
yeah, great question. I think that
Mm,
accessibility really needs to
mm,
continue to be at the forefront. I still think mental
mm,
health treatment is really difficult to come by, and
mhm,
unfortunately, especially for folks who are more low income, there's really limited
mm,
services that are being provided. So I think the barriers as far as insurance goes and just accessibility is going to be super key in allowing
mhm,
services to get out there. And then I am also hopeful that the expansion of mental health interventions and treatment will continue to evolve. A lot of modalities that folks are trained on in grad school are pretty archaic
mm,
and also just from a very white lens. And I
mm,
think really
mhm,
need to be expanded to different cultural backgrounds as well as integration of different healing modalities
mhm,
into mental health. And I think
yeah,
there's lots of folks who are doing really exciting work around that. But again,
mm,
to get it to the place of we're actually teaching this foundationally, it's
mm,
going to take a little bit of time.
mm,
So I'm very excited
yeah,
for when we get to that place, right? Where it's just
yeah,
like
yeah, the
that's
norm.
an aspect of folks are really
Yeah.
learning from the get-go.
Yeah, I think yeah, if I was taught anything about mental health as a child, yeah, it's like you always wonder, I wonder what person I would be now if I had learned some of these skills earlier on. But of course
Yeah.
we do the best with what we know and what we have access to. But I think accessibility is a huge one. I know there's platforms like that's I think it only came during the pandemic, but BetterHelp or like around the pandemic times. But yeah, I guess what you're saying, I guess the step one for people who really don't have access is maybe just like reading podcasts, gleaning like knowledge and skills from those things right now because it isn't easy, to
Yeah,
start.
it's
It
not
isn't easy
easy.
just to, and even when you do have insurance and all of that, sometimes it can take a while to get a placement with a therapist or their availability. Um, like all of these things, there was a lot I didn't know going into therapy, and I'm very grateful that I've had access to it. But it even took a couple of therapists to find the right fit. And I think a lot of people, because we live in a society, it's very out of convenience and needs to be packaged neatly and kind of like, I think of like just fast food place, like McDonald's or something. It's like we want something fast and easy and convenient. And it's like that is just not the name of the game with mental health. That
Yeah,
is just not how it works. You can't, fast forward your healing. You have
totally.
to, and it really is sometimes two steps forward, one step back, but you're going in the right direction. So I
Totally.
think just to give people peace of mind out there that you're doing great and you are where you're meant to be, even if it doesn't feel like it. So
Yes.
yeah. Yeah. But thank you so much, friend, for just joining me on this. I learned so much from you as I always do. And if people would like to learn more about what the work you're doing, where can they go and follow along?
Yeah, the best place to find
Yeah,
me is on Instagram at the Boundary Therapist.
amazing. And we'll link that below. Thank you.
Thank you so much.